The next thing we're going to look at is going to be our IV discs, our intervertebral discs. So these are going to be our weight-bearing and strength structures that are wedged between the bodies of all the vertebrae, with the exception of the C1, C2 joint. So right at the level of the atlas and axis, there is no disc between those because there's no real body to those vertebrae, if we remember the structure of those two. But for everything else, we have our annulus fibrosus. Right now I'm looking at L2 and L3. This is our IV disc outer circumference structure. So it'll really be the circumference around the central compartment of the disc. And so the core is going to be our nucleus pulposus. And this is a real like jelly consistency structure that's right in the middle. You can really think of the disc as kind of like a jelly donut because on the outside it's really tough and thick, whereas in the middle you have this very viscous center. So this is what gives us our flexibility, and the annulus fibrosus on the outside is going to be that thick, rigid part of the disc. And I think I had touched on it way back when. This might be the first lab, but with each descending joint between the vertebrae, as we get lower down, we have a thicker IV disc. And as we get lower down on the spine, we need to bear more weight. So here at the cervical level, you have a very thin disc. And as you get to the thoracic level, it starts to really widen. And at the level of the lumbar spine, you have a much larger, wider, thicker disc. So those are our intervertebral discs. So now we're going to look at our craniovertebral joints. So these are way up high. The first thing we're going to look at is going to be our atlanto-occipital joint. So as the name implies, it sits between the atlas, which is C1, and it's going to join in with the occipital plate of the skull. So right now I'm looking at the posterior membrane of it, but to highlight the whole thing, this is going to sit between the atlas and those occipital condyles on the skull that are lateral to the foramen magnum. And so this joint permits us to flex the head, giving us a yes motion. But the movement is limited by an anterior and posterior atlanto-occipital membrane. So I had highlighted the posterior membrane, and then in front of that is going to be our fibrous layer, and then in front of that is going to be that anterior membrane. So limited motion, but it does give us the head flexion. So that's our atlanto-occipital joint, pretty much at the top of the spinal column.